So the purpose of this final session is to provide a bit of a summary and wrap up, so I will start with a few summarizing comments. Ottmar will have a few, and then we will open it up to the floor for comments and observations from the group, after which I think we'll thank the organizers. But let me just start with some observations on the sessions that we've gone through these past 2 days. We started with this very interesting discussion on the double dividend hypothesis. And here I think there are two strands of the literature that often get conflated. There's the issue of whether there is a strong double dividend, which I think is a not so interesting question, as Rob, I think, pointed out. The second question is, what's the relationship between social marginal damages and the optimal tax rate? And there I think the conventional view, or the traditional view starting in the 90s, which was that the optimal tax rate was less than social marginal damages. I think there's a lot of new thinking on that with some of Antonio's work and others, that there are other forces that come into play that suggest that, in fact, the optimal tax could be higher. But in the spirit of simplicity that Rick is imploring us to keep in mind, it may be that the best advice is set the tax equal to social marginal damages as best you know that value. I mean, there's tremendous uncertainty there. I was struck in the discussion about deficit reduction that there's kind of a double whammy here. We have a carbon policy that benefits the future generations at the cost of the existing generations, and deficit reduction does sort of the same thing. So I'm really, it's puzzling to me that there is this sort of political linkage at times between the two, but maybe there's a way to do more interesting work in this area to better understand how those intergenerational distributions concerns can be addressed. I think the issues around rent taxation were quite fascinating, but I come back at the end to the small potato, big potato argument that I'm tempted to attribute to Mr. Potato Head, but I won't. I think it really suggests that where we really need to be thinking is the empirical magnitudes involved, and whether there's a there, how important that is. But I think it does suggest a research agenda for young economists looking for ideas of what they should be working on, empirically measuring this, taking into account such things as national ownership of resources, how that affects things, I think are all quite interesting. We had throughout the 2 days, we've had an interesting threaded discussion on dynamic commitment, both through the discussion of models and overlapping generations, some of the work that Warwick talked about today. And I was really struck, sort of jumping ahead to the last session, to something Catherine said in British Columbia, which is that the politicians love the revenue once it starts coming in. And I think that this suggests that once you have a carbon tax in place, once it is collecting revenue, which Australia didn't really get to so much, that may create a constituency for the tax that addresses some of the dynamic consistency commitment concerns. It doesn't fully address them in a way that perhaps an independent authority might. But I think there is a case to be made that once politicians come to rely on revenue streams, once they start coming in and are predictable. And I think these last two sessions were particularly interested in thinking about the focus on negotiating around price versus targets. I think that's a very important point, and it's very synergistic with the whole theme of this conference, which is that carbon taxes are an important revenue source, that they should be folded into the fiscal discussions, and it can be sort of reinforcing and beneficial to both. Certainly in the United States, a lot of the discussion around carbon taxation is around the need for revenue. And the final point I would make is that this last discussion was quite fascinating, and what I take from it is a couple of things. One is I fully agree with the statement that simplicity matters, simple messages to politicians, simple requests, though I think it is nuanced in the sense that simply saying to a politician in the United States, tax carbon, is not really compelling, because you then conflate the issue of environmental policy with the optimal size of government, and that's a huge issue in the United States. In fact, cap and trade, if you really want to slander cap and trade in the United States, you call it cap and tax. somehow this is even more prejudicial. So I think the idea of revenue neutral tax, carbon tax reform is incredibly important, at least in the United States. But I think that the message needs to be simple, but it needs to be customized for each audience. And what we also learn is that countries' experiences are very different. I was really struck at the difference in the discussion about sort of the evolution in the EU of the ETS system versus the Australian experience, and how starting with, I think, an imperfect ETS, they've somehow managed not to go down the path of poisoning the well in the sense that perhaps Australia has, but they've somehow managed to sort of evolve and improve. And then combining that with the thoughts about the importance of the Canadian provincial premier, who took this on sort of as a personal interest, it really speaks to a number of incredibly important aspects that we simply cannot model as economists in terms of what are the things that are going to ultimately drive our ability to have successful policy. And at the end of the day, all we can do is have great modeling on the shelf ready to go when the opportunity arises. And that just speaks, again, to the importance of the work that we're doing here. And so for that, I'm very grateful for the wonderful papers that were presented, as well as the discussion that's ensued. And I thank you all for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. My feeling is that I learned a lot, and yesterday I made a lot of notes what I learned, but unfortunately I lost my notes. So therefore I have to summarize again what I have learned. So let me start with the first aspect on the double dividend. And there was this debate, should be the carbon price higher than the social cost of carbon or lower and so on. But then there was this feeling that, at least in the room, that we should have a simple message to the politicians. However, from my point of view, the next discussion on intergeneral justice convinced me that this simple message will not work, because what you have shown is basically that the climate change problem is a long-term problem. So we have the costs now and the benefits later. And what you have shown us with your models is that this will not change, basically not in the models you have, for example, if you use the carbon revenues to reduce debt and so on. So it even makes the problem more severe. So in that sense, after this second session, I had the feeling, okay, when we play around this problem and put this whole tax systems and the second best scenarios and the double dividends in a more dynamic perspective, in the overlapping generation perspective, so we are back at stage one to a certain extent. So in that sense, I feel from a research point of view and from a research agenda's point of view, it is worthwhile to pursue this issue. For example, it seems to me it is worthwhile to endogenize debt policies, to come up with optimal policies. All these things should be done. But having in mind that this might be a research agenda which does not help us to come up with another simpler message to the policymakers. I have to say I'm convinced that as long as we communicate to the public that the climate change problem is a long-term problem, we have the costs now and the benefits later, I am not sure that we will be successful politically. So it seems to me it is worthwhile to think about short-term benefits. And I have seen a few papers who highlighted the short-term benefits. The one was, for example, in the context of tax competition, when we invest in local public goods, which has necessarily nothing to do with environmental problems, just investments in local public goods, but when we can then use carbon taxes instead of labor taxes and capital taxes. So this obviously provides short-term benefits, and it seems to me this is a worthwhile avenue which should be pursued in the future research agenda, because this is something which helps us to think about the long-term and the short-term issue. And then this whole fascinating issue of rent taxation. It seems to me this is a very important aspect here. And I learned basically two things. We should not only think about the fixed factor in production like land, it is worthwhile to think about the adjustment costs of capital. And depending on the adjustment costs, we have many relatively fixed factors in production. And these factors in production can be impacted by mitigation and by the climate impacts. So both aspects can create rents, and it is worthwhile to think about how these rents can be taxed and how these rents can be taxed away, and also to have in mind that all kinds of climate and environmental policy has a component to create rents. And in that sense, it's worthwhile to think about the small and the big potato stuff, but nevertheless, it seems to me it is worthwhile to think carefully from a conceptual point of view. So for me, the biggest challenge is international cooperation. But what I learned from this debate on international cooperation are basically two important aspects. The one is, it is worthwhile to think much more carefully about this concept of focal points. From my point of view, in a formalized way, because I find this very interesting, but to understand what are precise focal points, what are prices, or could be better focal points than quantities, it's one aspect. And the other one, which I find very fascinating, what Warwick put on the table, this is this issue of long-term assets. This is something where you create, so to say, ownership, and to be a little bit more metaphorical, ownership on the rightful ownership on the atmosphere, something like this, in the long term, from a long-term perspective, and to have an institution at a national scale which allows us to define secure property rights is a very fascinating starting point, and to link this long-term perspective with the short-term perspective. So this is something which it's also quite fascinating. My last point is on this carbon pricing. So Rick said, communicate to the politicians, to the finance ministers, tax carbon, it's good for you, it's good for us. So then this reminds me to a conversation I had, and I cannot reveal the name, but it was a prime minister, former prime minister of a very important country. And this was my first exercise, and I approached him and say, look, carbon taxation is a very good idea. And I continued and say, because of several reasons. And he said to me, he listened 5 minutes and says, okay, and I got your point, but you have to understand, in my country, if I impose a carbon tax on my economy, this is almost the same as committed to political suicide. So my question is, after listening in the morning to these fascinating questions, so we had the feeling in economics, carbon taxation is a wonderful thing in one way or another. But two questions: why we failed in many, many countries to impose and to implement a carbon tax? And I was very grateful about the report in Australia, because this helps us that we Germans look much better now with our German energy transition. I'm not a big fan of the German energy transition, but after the failure in other countries, I feel much better. But this does not help us in the end, because we have to understand why we failed, and why a theoretical concept where many people in the room feel this should be implemented, can be implemented, why this is such a complicated way how to implement it in an appropriate way. And I find it very helpful when people say sometimes this trial and error approach, this incremental approach, does not help, because it can poison, so to say, the whole atmosphere about the political debate for almost a decade. And I have to say, I'm very afraid that this could happen also in Germany after the Energiewende, or the energy transition, that we are in the middle of a mess. And in the end, this will not be a starting point to improve the institutions, but it could be just the end of a political debate about transition and carbon taxation for the next, almost for the next decade. So this is something which I learned, and I found this workshop really very enlightened. And I have to say, I had a lot of workshops within the IPCC, without the IPCC, but I have to say it was one of the best workshops I attended, and I'm very grateful to all of you for these fascinating papers and for this exciting and very, the style of debate we had was from my point of view really wonderful, because people listened and people responded, and we had a lot of light and not too much heat in the room.